Hello guys, it's been a while since I've uploaded a video, but I have some pretty exciting news today. I have decided to replace my first generation X58 with the 12th generation Alder Lake CPU. But don't worry, I still plan to bring plenty of X58 content. More than 10 years ago, I felt as if I had the cutting edge in technology. My Intel X58 platform included tech such as USB 3.0, SATA 3 and SATA 6 ports, dual PCIe 2.0, but now, looking at the 12th generation Alder Lake CPU and the Z690 chipset more than a decade later, we see DDR4 and DDR5, 3200 and 4800 MHz supported, PCIe 5.0 and 4.0 connected directly to the CPU. Other nice 12th generation technology includes M.2 slots, USB 3, but not the same USB 3 that my X58 motherboard used. Intel's Z690 boards support USB 3, 5G, 10G, and 20G. So for me personally, this should be a massive upgrade since I have skipped so many releases from both Intel and AMD. So as usual, guys, I would like for you all to be sure to read the article. I put a lot of effort and time into this article. There's a lot of information in the article about the 12th generation Alder Lake CPU. So please check out the article, guys. I appreciate it. Intel's Alder Lake microarchitecture contains coves, known as performance cores. The performance cores in this case are the Golden Cove CPU microarchitecture, and the efficient cores are the Gracemont microarchitecture. The Golden Coves contain hyperthreading capabilities and are the high-performance workhorses that we expect. However, on the other hand, we have Gracemont, which are the efficient cores, once again, which lacks hyperthreading, but has been designed for throughput and light background tasks in many cases. This should allow the CPU to use as little power as possible when you aren't taking full advantage of the Alder Lake CPU performance. For more information, please check out the article. It goes into detail about the architecture for the performance cores and the efficient cores. Now that we have learned about Alder Lake's microarchitecture, one has to wonder how the performance cores and the efficient cores complete workloads efficiently. That's where the Intel Thread Director comes into play. Intel, along with Microsoft, has created a solution between the software and the hardware to determine which performance or efficient cores will complete the workloads. This is accomplished by Intel's Thread Director polling the instructions within the core. To support this at the software level, Windows 11 will be needed to take full advantage of this technology. Intel has been working closely with Microsoft to ensure that Alder Lake microarchitecture can communicate with the Windows 11 operating system. Intel is also the first company to release PCIe 5 to the consumer market with Alder Lake. Alder Lake will support a direct connection to a single or dual PCIe 5 slot. PCIe 4.0 will be directly connected to the CPU as well for a SSD or Intel Optane memory storage solution. PCIe 5.0 can theoretically use up to 64 gigabytes with ease. The Z690 chipset will be capable of PCIe 4 and PCIe 3. Now we will take a look at the hardware that I decided to purchase. I purchased the Core i9-12900K with DDR5 4800 MHz RAM to show the default performance. The motherboard that I chose was the ASUS ROG Strix FZ690 motherboard, along with the Fentex 80 Plus Platinum 1200 watt PSU. Now we will take a deep dive into the Alder Lake microarchitecture. Starting with the performance cores 0 to 15, we see that the latency average is 27.59 nanoseconds. The lowest latency recorded was 4.25 nanoseconds on Core 7. The highest latency recorded was 33.75 nanoseconds between Core 2 and Core 13. This isn't bad at all. Well, that is until the P cores need to communicate with the E cores. At that point, the latency begins to climb for certain P cores. The efficient core shows much higher latencies. The efficient cores are smaller Intel Atom cores that are clustered together in groups of 4. Cores 16 to 23 are our efficient Atom cores. The average latency amongst the E cores is 40.2 nanoseconds, with the lowest latency recorded showing 31 nanoseconds. Since the 8 Atom cores are grouped into a cluster of 4, the maximum latency is very high at 51.5 nanoseconds. We see that the P cores, Core 0 to Core 15, have a much higher latency when compared to the E cores, which are Core 16 to Core 23. I thought this was very interesting. The efficient cores can access data to and from DRAM by as much as 1.9 times faster than the performance cores. It should be noted that this benchmark tests random memory locations as well. The performance cores latency is 92% higher than the efficient cores. Now we see how the efficient Atom cores obtain efficiency and high throughput. Latency to the L3 cache shows that the P core's latency is 34 nanoseconds while the E cores average 33 nanoseconds. Latency to L2 cache shows that the P cores average around 2.0 nanoseconds to 2.1 nanoseconds. As I go deeper into the microarchitecture, it becomes harder to benchmark the E cores, but we can see that they all share a similar latency of 5.2 nanoseconds. This could be due to the fact that they are clustered and share the same L2 cache. L1 cache latency shows that the P cores average around 1.1 nanoseconds, and all of the efficient cores show the same latency at 0.8 nanoseconds. In this benchmark, the efficient cores appear to outperform the performance cores by 20%. Here's a chart that shows all of my benchmark results. Intel claims that Alder Lake S can support up to 1,000 gigabytes of bandwidth within the microarchitecture interconnect fabric. I wanted to know how much bandwidth I could get with my Alder Lake S CPU and DDR5 4800 MHz. Let's take a look at all of the P and E cores. I was able to get 713 gigabytes of total bandwidth in my test. This is fairly close to the 1000 gigabytes, but we must remember that the 1000 gigabytes that Intel claimed isn't all dedicated to only the cores. Now let's take a look at the efficient cores. In this benchmark, I attempted to determine how much performance I could get from both clusters. The average was 176 gigabytes a second, so the E cores are well equipped to handle various workloads. The best performance I recorded was 413 gigabytes a second. In the previous benchmark, we saw both efficient clusters working together. Now I would like to take a look at how well each cluster works independently. This should show the best case scenario since only 4 efficient cores will work on the same workload and not have to worry about long cycles or latency to the second efficient cluster. This benchmark shows how efficient both clusters can be if they are working on separate workloads. Each cluster can output 150 gigabytes per second. As long as the efficient clusters doesn't need to share data, we will see that it is possible to accomplish roughly 307 gigabytes a second. This chart will show the differences between the P and E cores. We can now see the difference between all of the core segments and how well they work together. Now we will take a look at the top performance for a Golden Cove and a single Gracemont core. This shows a single Golden Cove using the best case scenario. The average bandwidth was 760 gigabytes and peaked at 1 terabyte. The best case scenario for a single Gracemont core shows 283 gigabytes on average and peaked at 407 gigabytes a second. Now that we have seen the top performance for single core results, I will run all 8 performance cores against all 8 efficient cores. Starting first with the performance cores, we can see that when all 8 cores are working together at the lowest level, they can achieve some serious performance. Using various workloads, the average came out to 3,196 gigabytes, or in other words, 3.2 terabytes a second. This is extremely high, and the maximum performance topped out at 4.5 terabytes under specific workloads. All 8 Gracemont efficient cores can move 2,424 gigabytes on average, or 2.4 terabytes. Earlier in the latency benchmark, we saw that the Gracemont cores could access the L1 cache 20% quicker than the performance cores. Well, in a particular benchmark during the test, the E cores showed a 79.2% increase over the performance cores. However, outside of that one scenario where the efficient cores outperformed the performance cores, in the other test, the performance cores make up for it with a 345% increase over the E cores. Please check out the article for more in-depth information. Now that we have a decent idea of how much performance we can expect from the Alder Lake microarchitecture, we can now take a look at several synthetic benchmarks to see how quickly the i9-12-900K can compete with various workloads. This chart shows the total system wattage. This chart does not include additional wattage for a discrete GPU, so only the CPU, RAM, and motherboard wattage is shown below. You can see that Alder Lake is very efficient for light workloads and idle periods. Light usage such as opening browsers, opening folders, or apps shows that Alder Lake consumes roughly 74 watts. That number drops to 65 watts if the PC isn't being used. The entire system uses 330 watts while using the CPU at 100%. The Alder Lake CPU itself only used 214 watts on average. I haven't had a lot of time to go through all of the overclocking settings. I have only had the i9-12900K for about 5 days at the time of this video, so the biggest bump of performance will be coming from the efficient cores. I was able to bump the P cores up slightly to 5 GHz and the E cores up to 4 GHz. While using the CPU at 100%, we can see an increase of roughly 36 watts on average over the stock settings. The maximum peak wattage increased by 41 watts. I will need more time with the ASUS ROG Strix F motherboard and the Alder Lake CPU to get the most out of overclocking. So there should definitely be more overclocking videos and articles coming soon. There was a lot of concern about the 12th generation CPU power usage. The 12900K is rated to use up to 241 watts, but the typical use would be far below that. As efficient as the 12th gen is at low usage scenarios, I wondered if there was a way to make the maximum performance more efficient at stock frequencies. The system stability appears to be rock solid after lowering the CPU voltage. I captured some data while running the CPU at 100%. Alder Lake appears to be very efficient, and I'm not sure why Intel released a CPU with high power limits. The system only used 273 watts. The CPU itself only used 180 watts, which is a drop of 44 watts. I was also able to drop the CPU temperature by 11 Celsius on average when running the CPU at 100%. So we have reached the end of my Alder Lake 12900K review. And overall, I can say that it has been a pleasant surprise. Alder Lake has finally pulled me away from Intel's 2008 X58, and so far it appears to be worth it. The overclocking features have also been a nice surprise, and there are tons of options for enthusiasts to tweak. I enjoyed taking a deep dive into Alder Lake's microarchitecture, but I also enjoyed underclocking the 12900K and making it a very efficient CPU. The Intel Core 12th generation release was smooth, but the OEMs did not have the LGA 1700 CPU coolers or brackets available for a lot of users. To get the most out of Alder Lake, you would need to use the Windows 11 operating system. As I continue to learn more about the platform, I will be writing more articles and creating more videos. Let me know what you guys think below about Intel's 12th generation CPU in the comments section. If you enjoy the content, please donate to my PayPal or consider joining my Patreon. The links are listed below. I am sorry for keeping you guys waiting for a new video, but as you can see, I was planning a new PC build, so stay tuned for more content. So with all of that being said, I want to thank you all for watching my videos and reading my reviews. Please be sure to check out my Alder Lake review article on the website, overclockedendgame.com, for more in-depth information about Alder Lake.